Assalamu alaikum, welcome to economics Telikilaas. This is Mabruk sir from Shanato School. So today I am going to deliver the second lesson on exchange rate. So before I begin with the lesson, I would like to request everyone to have your notebook and your textbook with you so that you can note down important learning that you learn from this lesson as well. In today's lesson, you are going to study how floating exchange rate is determined. So before I begin with the lesson, I would like to recall what you studied in the previous lesson, which was about the introduction of exchange rate, isn't it? In previous lesson, you studied the definition of exchange rate, which is the value of one currency in terms of another currency. For example, price of Maldivian currency in terms of US dollar. $1 is equal to 15.42. That is called an exchange rate. Then later you studied the different types of exchange rate, that is fixed exchange rate and floating exchange rate. In a fixed exchange rate, government set a particular rate that do not change with the change in the demand for the currency and supply of the currency. Unlike that, in a floating exchange rate, it fluctuates with the change in the demand for the currency and supply of the currency. It does not remain at a certain value. Then you studied some important terminologies, which is appreciation of currency and depreciation of currency. Appreciation of currency means raising the value of a currency in a floating exchange rate, and depreciation of a currency is falling the value of a currency in a floating exchange rate. So here is your learning intention for this lesson. We are learning to analyze how the float exchange rate is determined in the foreign exchange market and success criteria. You will be successful if you can explain how floating exchange rate is determined and illustrate a floating exchange rate using a demand and a supply diagram. So I am going to explain the definition of it and how it is going to determine and show the impact on exchange rate by using demand and supply diagram, which is very simple. Okay, here the definition of floating exchange rate. As you know that you already studied this definition in the last lesson, but I would like to recall it again because we are focusing today's lesson only about floating exchange rate. So a floating exchange rate is the exchange rate in which the rate will change frequently. Frequently means very often it will change. It won't remain at the same rate. For example, it may change hourly basis or daily. So in some foreign exchange market, it will change very quickly. So why it changes? That's the question, right? It is because it is determined by the market forces of demand and supply of that currency. Now you know that floating exchange won't remain at a certain rate, and you know that the reason for that is the exchange rate is determined through the interaction of demand for the currency and supply of the currency, isn't it? So that's the main reason why floating exchange rate won't remain at a certain fixed level. Now let me explain how floating exchange rate is determined by using a demand supply diagram. As you understood from the definition that a floating exchange rate is determined through the interaction of demand and supply, right? So now here is the typical demand and supply diagram. There is no difference with the demand curve and supply curve. The only difference here is the labeling of it. On vertical axis, you always write the price of one currency in terms of another currency. In this example, I have taken price of Indian rupees in dollar. If you want to write price of Maldivian currency in dollar or price of dollars in euro, whatever the currency you would like, you can still write on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis you are going to write the quantity of Indian rupee. The labeling is very important. Usually we write the price of one currency against US dollar because US dollar is the most common currency that we are using in international market for trading. So here's the demand curve, which shows the downward sloping curve from left to the right, and here's the upward sloping curve from left to right. There's no difference in that curve. And what is the exchange rate? Exchange rate in a floating exchange rate is where demand for the currency and supply of the currency equal. That is the value marked at P. So for example, in this situation we are saying that 1 Indian rupee is equal to $0.013. That's where That's the value where demand for the currency and supply of the currency meet. So it is circled with the orange color, isn't it? Now let me connect your prior learning to new learning. So since in this session we are talking about the foreign currency or currency market, it is always important to connect what you already learned to this one, because it is very interconnected. For example, in goods market is where we trade tangible things, for example strawberries, computers, stationeries and so on, right? So here's a question for you: what happens to price if a demand of a product decrease? Meaning that if people's willingness and ability to buy a product decrease, what will happen to price? Now you can think about it. If demand of a product decrease, the price falls, isn't it? Because people's willingness and ability to buy the product has fallen now, so as a result the price will fall. And the second question: what happens to price if a supply of a product decrease? What happens to price if a supply of a product decrease? Now think. If supply decreases, the price rise, isn't it? So what happens in a currency market? Unlike goods market, in a currency market we trade, we buy and sell currencies, right? For example, we buy and sell dollars, pound, rupees, Argentinian peso and so on, isn't it? So here the question for you: what happens to price or value of the currency if a demand for the currency rises or supply decreases? Here's the hint for you. The law of supply and law of demand remain same in goods market or in currency market as well. So now think, if people's willingness and ability to buy the currency increases or supply decreases, what will happen to the price? Yes, the price definitely it will rise, right? So in a floating exchange rate, if price of currency rises, we say that it is an appreciation of the currency, isn't it? Now let me explain increase in demand using a demand supply diagram. Okay, here is the demand supply diagram. The labeling is really important. As I mentioned earlier, on vertical axis you always write the price of one currency in terms of another currency. In this situation, I am going to write price of MVR in US dollar, and on horizontal axis you always write the quantity of MVR, and here is the typical demand supply. As I mentioned in the definition, the floating exchange rate is determined through the interaction of demand and supply. So initially, without the change in the demand, the initial exchange rate in a floating exchange rate market is set at P, because it is the value where demand and supply equals, isn't it? Okay, now the next question is, what will happen to the demand curve if demand increases? You can link your prior learning to this one. There won't be any change in the concept. If the demand increase, will it shift to the right or will it shift to the left, students? Yes, it will shift to the right. So now it will shift from D to D1. As a result of that, now the new equilibrium value or new exchange rate value will be at the value where D1 equals to the supply, that is set at P1, isn't it? So what has happened to the currency? The price of currency rise. Which currency, students? The price of Maldivian currency has increased or rise. So what is the terminology that we used in floating exchange rate if the price of currency increase? It is appreciation, isn't it? So we say that Maldivian currency appreciated against dollar. Okay, now let me put some figures into the diagram that helps you to understand it more clearly. Students, I am not using the exact exchange rate, but I am using just random figures in order to make you understand it. Okay, now let's say that initially, without the change in the demand supply, the initial exchange rate in a floating exchange rate is 0.065. But with the change in demand, the exchange rate value has increased to the $1, meaning that 1 unit of MVR now can buy more US dollar. For example, Initially, 1 MVR can buy $0.065, but with the increase in demand, now 1 MVR can buy more dollar, which is 1, isn't it? With the same amount, we can buy more of dollar, right? So what has happened to MVR? The MVR has appreciated against dollar. The opposite will happen to the US dollar in this situation. The US dollar has depreciated against MVR because initially they have to spend 0.065 in order to get 1 MVR, but now with the change they have to spend more dollars, that is $1 to get 1 MVR. So we say dollar has depreciated against MVR, but MVR has appreciated against dollar. Now I am going to show the decrease in supply using a demand supply diagram. So in this on vertical axis you always write the price of one currency in terms of another currency, isn't it? So here I am going to write the price of MVR in dollar, but if you want the right price of MVR in euro or price of MVR in pound, still you can write it. On horizontal axis it is quantity of MVR, right? So here is the typical demand supply diagram. The current floating exchange rate is set at P. Why, students? Because it is the price where demand for the currency and supply of the currency equals, isn't it? So here's the question for students: what will happen to the supply curve if supply decreases? Will it shift to the right or will it shift to the left? Yes, students, it will shift to the left, right? So the supply curve will shift from S to S1. There is a new supply curve now. So what is the new equilibrium value or equilibrium price now, students? It is the value where S1 equal to D, right? So it is set at P1. So what has happened to the price in this situation? The price has increased. So we say the price of currency rise, the price of MVR increased. So that is called the appreciation of currency. So when I replace the figure in the diagram, it will show the same impact. Now we can know that in the previous one also and in this one also we say we will see the same impact, isn't it? So in this situation the MVR, for 1 MVR we can buy $0.065. With the change for 1 MVR we can buy more dollar, so that is appreciation of MVR, isn't it? The bottom line is, if demand for the currency increases and supply of the currency falls, what will happen to the price, students? The price of currency will rise. So in a floating exchange rate we say that if a price of one currency increases, that is called an appreciation of the currency, isn't it? So let me show or make it simple by showing a numerical example. So initially $1 is equal to 16.30. This is not the real figures, real exchange rate, but in order to make you understand I am using some random figures. Okay, now with the change $1 now cost 15.42. So now we have spent less of MVR to buy the same $1. So previously we had spent 16.30, now we had spent less than 16.30, which is 15.42, in order to get the same $1. So what has happened to the Maldivian currency value? The Maldivian currency value has increased, so that is called appreciation of Maldivian currency. Okay, now here's the next part of it. So here's the question for students: what happens to price or value of the currency if a demand for the currency falls or supply rises? If demand for the currency falls or supply rises, it will definitely make price to fall, right? Price of currency will fall. So in a floating exchange rate we say that if a price of currency falls, that is called a depreciation of the currency, isn't it? That is called a depreciation of the currency. Let me show the decrease in demand using a demand supply diagram as well. So here's the diagram. On vertical axis you write the price of one currency in terms of another currency. On horizontal axis you write the quantity. So in this situation, on vertical axis I write the price of MVR in dollars, and on horizontal axis quantity of MVR. So before the changes, the initial floating exchange rate is set at P, that is where demand equals to supply, isn't it? So here the question, so if the demand decreases, to which side the demand curve will shift? Is it right or left? Yes, the demand curve will shift to the left from D to D1, isn't it? So we can say it is an inward shift. Sometimes we say instead of left, inward shift as well. So when demand curve shift to the left, the new equilibrium value is where D1 equals to supply. So the new floating exchange rate is set at P1. So what has happened to price now? The price has fallen from P to P1, isn't it? P to P1. So we can say that the price of currency has fallen, isn't it? So in a floating exchange rate, we say that depreciation of the currency. So which currency has depreciated in here? The Maldivian currency has depreciated against dollar. So let me replace the letters with the figure as well. So initially 1 MVR cost $1, but with the change now 1 MVR cost 0.065. So it means 1 unit of MVR can buy less US dollar now. Initially for 1 MVR we can get $1, but with the change in demand now with for the same MVR we can buy less dollar, that is 0.065, isn't it? Then increase in supply. If the supply curve increases, the supply curve will shift to the right, isn't it? So this also makes price to fall. So we say that the same thing happened as before. So the price of currency falls, MVR falls. So we say that now with the same amount of MVR we can buy less MVR. So the same explanation goes to this one as well. So we say MVR has depreciated against dollar, but the dollar has appreciated. Understand? The bottom line of this is that if there is a decrease in demand for the currency and increase in the supply of the currency, it will cause price of currency to, students, can you guess? So the price of currency will falls, right? So in a floating exchange rate we say that a fall in price of currency in a floating exchange rate is that depreciation of the currency, isn't it? So we say it is the depreciation of the currency. Okay, now let me show depreciation of currency by using a numerical example, so it will help you to understand it clearly, isn't it? Okay, let's say that initially $1 is equal to 15.42 MVR, but with the change now $1 is equal to 16.30 rupiah, meaning that now we had spent more to get the same dollar. Previously we had spent just 15.42, but with the change now we had to spend more of our currency, more of MVR to buy the same $1. So we say that there is a depreciation of a MVR, but the US dollar has appreciated because that for the same $1 now they can get more of our currency, isn't it? So before I conclude the main lesson, I would like to summarize what we studied just now. So we know that in a floating exchange rate, the exchange rate is determined by the demand for the currency and supply of a currency, isn't it? And we know that if there is a fall in demand for the currency or increase in the supply of the currency, it will cause a depreciation. It will cause a depreciation. And similarly, if there is a rise in demand for the currency or decrease in the supply, it will cause an appreciation of the currency. So basically this is main three ideas we studied in this lesson. Here is your self-assessment part. There are several questions that you can answer in order to determine whether you are successful in this lesson or whether you have fully achieved what you have studied in this lesson. So the first question is, how floating exchange rate is determined? Very easy question and very straightforward question, isn't it? And the next question is, what change in demand for a currency or supply of a currency cause a depreciation? And the third question is, what change in demand for a currency or supply of currency cause an appreciation. So in this two questions, you just mention the changes to the demand and supply. You don't have to write the causes that change demand for the currency or supply of the currency. That is the topic that we will discuss later. Okay, and the final question is, draw a diagram to illustrate a depreciation of a currency against US dollar. So make sure you label it correct and draw only one diagram to illustrate this depreciation of a currency against US dollar. Here is the end of the lesson. I hope everyone enjoyed and understood the lesson. Hope to see you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.